We're doing a series on the generals from Quincy as we'll be dedicating a park and bridge in the generals' honors this year. And one of the generals we're honoring is Major General Charlie Sweeney, and I'm joined today by his son Joe Sweeney, who in his own right joined as a veteran, who's a Marine, and came out as a colonel. And we thank him for his service. But we're going to talk a little bit about the contributions made by these generals, but in particular today, the contributions by Major General Chuck Sweeney, who really brought the war to an end, a war that saw a lot of death and horror. It was his mission that actually ended World War II. So I'm glad to be joined today by his son, Joe Sweeney, a name that is very familiar in Quincy and certainly this region. A great family from Montclair. Growing up in Quincy, I was from Norfolk Downs. You were Montclair, other side of the tracks.
Right.
Welcome, Joe.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I'd like to talk a little bit about you growing up in a big family with quite a famous guy. So I know we know a lot about, and we'll get into a little bit about what your father did and his service to our nation, but maybe talk a little bit about growing up in Montclair and about your father as a father. Where do you fall in the line?
I'm the ninth of 10, and there were 7 girls and 3 boys.
Your poor father.
And Dad was a great dad, and I just although he was a general when I was born, and everybody always said, "What's it like being the son of a general?" And I just thought everybody's dad was a general. I mean, there was no difference to me. Yeah. He was just a great guy, and there wasn't. I think he shut it off when he got home, and he was just a loving dad. But
I was number 7 of 8.
oh, okay.
So I did notice that the younger ones, my father was a little more, not quite as strict as he was with the older ones. Was that the same with you?
It seemed that way to us.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
And he grew up on Hamilton Ave, and his dad had a plumbing and heating business, and they originally from the North Shore, and 1920 they started building the Montclair area, and so he got the contract to put the plumbing and the heating in those homes. And eventually in 1926, because he had 6 children, my father being the second oldest, he bought 124 Hamilton Ave. And my dad loved his neighborhood. He loved all his friends, and he said he used to ride his bike all around, and he was the paper boy. I think it was the Record American back then. And, he used to do Wilson Ave and Harvard Street and Newfield Street and, that whole neighborhood. So
Probably more bicycles on the road then than there were cars, right?
I bet, yeah.
Some of my uncles worked at Dennehy's farm in Montclair when they were kids.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, so much of Montclair was farmland way back then.
Right. And that's when they started developing these homes.
And you yourself went into the military.
Yes, in 1981, I was at Coleman's Sporting Goods store in Quincy Center, because everybody went to Coleman's for everything.
Right.
And on Saturdays, you could buy 2 Coho hockey sticks for $5, which, I think now would be $150 per stick. But in any event, I ran into Staff Sergeant Russ Carpenter of the Marine Corps, and he started talking, and I said, I got nothing going on. I could do that. And so I ended up enlisting in the Marine Corps in 1981.
Right out of high school?
No, it had been a couple of years. I actually had a couple of years of college behind me, and I had quit because I thought I was smarter than everybody else. And I was just working in Boston driving a truck, and I said, my dad's in the military.
I was going to say, how'd the general feel about the Marines?
Well, it was funny. So I went home, and he was, sitting there reading the Boston Sunday Globe, and I knew they were coming to get me at, 0:30 the next morning. And so I went in, and I said, "Dad, I just enlisted in the Marine Corps." And he didn't say anything. He was just smoking a cigar and reading the Globe, and I just said, "Okay, well, I guess I'm going to go out with my friends because, I won't going to see anybody for 3 months."
How about your mother? How'd she feel?
Well, so my dad just put the paper down, and he just said, "Hey, old pal," he said, they're going to kick the, what out of you. And I said, thanks, Dad.
I'm sure he's proud.
Yeah, he was very proud, of course. Yeah, yeah. And my mother was fine. She came from 6 children as well, and a lot of them were served in the military. Both her brothers were in the Marine Corps and the Navy and whatnot. So and she herself was a World War II vet.
Oh, no kidding.
Yes. She was proud. As
So it was in the blood.
it was, I guess, in the blood. But as my father would say later, he said, it was just one less mouth to feed.
I can remember when I had an older brother who joined the Army right out of high school, and he was 17, so parents had to sign off at the time, and they were glad to sign off.
Right. Yes. Yes.
So a number of years ago, I know we were talking before we went on air a little bit about the dedication we had at North Quincy High School.
Yes.
And we honored a number of individuals. In fact, we honored pretty much every veteran that went to North. And some didn't graduate because they went right into the service ahead of time.
Right.
And your dad was one of those individuals that there's kind of murals up on the wall there of the pictures and the stories of, we just singled out 5 of them, and your dad was one of them. And
Right.
it really, this past summer when things got a little crazy with the pandemic and some of the social justice stuff, some of the younger kids were on social media very critical of the men we were honoring in the atrium. And it really bothered me because they were critical in a sense that they didn't know their history. And they would talk about these guys being the aggressors, and couldn't be further from the truth. And I know your father had gotten to the point where he was a little concerned about how the story was being told.
Exactly.
And he actually wrote a book himself.
Right.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about your father's role and how he came to.
Yeah. So Dad, when he was 15, I want to just digress a little bit. When he was 15, in that neighborhood, the old Wallaston Golf Club used to be, which where President's is now, and he started to caddy. And he caddied for 2 individuals who were prominent later in his life, and that was Francis Cardinal Spellman and James Michael Curley, who was the mayor, governor, and congressman from Boston. But I'll
Both famous names.
right. But so I'll get back, tell that story later. But anyway, and then he went to North Quincy High. He played sports. I believe he was in the drama club, and he was just your typical Quincy kid, and had never been on an airplane. When he was 18, he graduated from North Quincy High School in 1937. And there was an old, where Marina Bay is now, there was a Naval Air Station. I'm sure many people remember, but there was also a small airport, civilian airport called Denison. And so he went down to Denison with his buddy Charlie McCauley, and Charlie said, I want to take a ride in an airplane, and it's $2. And my father says, I don't have $2, And I can't ask my parents because they'll kill me if they know I'm in an airplane. So he had a paper route, and he had scraped together $2, and he went up, and the pilot, they were an open air plane, and they were in the front, and the pilot was in the back, and the guy just went all around Boston Harbor and around Quincy, and had the thrill of his life. And he just got out of the aircraft, and he said, I know what I'm going to do the rest of my life. I said, I'm going to fly. I'm going to fly. And so behind my parents' back, his parents, I'm sorry, he started to apply to the Army Air Corps because the Air Force didn't exist. So it was the Army Air Corps, and they had an aviation wing. So he applied, did pretty well. He was very good in the math and sciences and whatnot. And so he did well on the tests, the physical and all that. And he, had to get his parents to sign off back in those days. So his father signed it right away. And his mother just, when he approached her, she said, absolutely not. And this is 1930s. Actually, it was 1940 by now. But there were no, the United States was not in war. There was no possibility we were going to be in a war, and his vision of flying was, well, I'm going to go to flight school and I'm going to get a pair of cool sunglasses and a white scarf and a leather jacket, and I'm going to meet girls. That was, he wanted to be a flyboy. And, that was his intentions. And so eventually his mother signed off. And he went to flight training and did very well in flight training. And at the end of flight training was the day that will live in infamy, 7 December 1941, which, with the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And the next day he was commissioned, a second lieutenant, and they said, here's your wings, you're gone. So he went to Jefferson Proving Grounds in Indiana first for a short time, and then he went to Eglin Airfield, which was where the biggest airfield in, I believe, in the United States. And he went through the ranks quick. He picked up captain, and he became the base operations officer. And at that time, the reputation for Sweeney was, hey, he'll fly anything. You have a test plane, you have anything, he'll fly it. So he quickly became qualified on 60 different aircraft at the age of 23. And when I said, Dad, you were qualified on 60, aircraft? And he said, well, because that's all he had in the inventory, So one day the base commander called him up. He said, Chuck, I need you to cordon off the airfield. He said, with this plane coming in, and I don't want anybody to see it. I don't want anybody near it. And of course, it sparked his interest. And so he did everything he had to do and set up part of runway and whatnot. And he was in the tower watching the plane come in, and it was the first time he had seen an actual B-29. So it's just sparked his interest. He's like, as he said, it was the Cadillac of airplanes. He's like, oh my God, look at this thing. He said, I got to get into that.
Some argue it changed the war eventually.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So he jumped in a Jeep, and he went out, past security, and that's where he first met Colonel Paul Tibbets. Tibbets got out of the plane, and he said, sir, I'm Captain Sweeney. I'm here at your disposal, whatever you need. And, what a beautiful aircraft and, whatnot. And then he put all the spies around the base, and he said, follow that guy. And, that night when Colonel Tibbets went to the officers' club for dinner, of course, my father showed up at the same time. And
He was no dummy.
and he just said, because he was dying to fly it, and he said, Colonel, would you like to have dinner? So they had dinner, and every chance he got, he told him about his flying escapades. And Colonel Tibbets said, well, I'm going to Wichita tomorrow. Would you like to go? He said, I'd love to. So they started doing trips together daily. And then after the third trip, Colonel Tibbets said, Chuck, why don't you take the wheel? So he's like, great. So he started to fly it, and he just loved it. He fell in love with it. And Colonel Tibbets said, he goes, I like your style, kid. He said, why don't you join my unit? And of course, my father was elated, but he said, well, sir, I have orders to India at the end of the year, and, I can't change those. And he says, well, let me see what I can do. So he's thinking to himself, I know he's a colonel, but he's a colonel in the Air Corps, not the Army Air Corps, which, the Army wasn't, too hot on. But he said, I'll see what will happen. And then the next day, he was thrilled when Colonel Tibbets changed his orders and said he was now part of the 509th Composite Group. So that's how it all started. Yeah.
And neither one of them had any idea at that point.
They had no idea what they were training for. So from there, they went to Grand Island, Nebraska, and they were just doing flying. He had a group of pilots. He just said, I want you to train every day on the aircraft. And that's what they did. And my father was thrilled when General Curtis LeMay, who was the commander of all the aircraft, said, let me see the B-29. And Colonel Tibbets said, let me give you one of my best pilots. And my father was thrilled when he picked him. And so you know, as a young captain and you have a general and he's thinking, oh boy, you know, he said, I'll get this guy up in the air and dazzle him with my brilliance, you know, but, you know, LeMay was you know, a nut and bolts guy, and he said the first day they just sat in the aircraft for 20, you know, it seemed like 24 hours, and he just said, tell me about this, and tell me about this, and my father said, luckily I knew more about that aircraft than I thought I did, and he said the second day we went flying, and he said it was very intimidating, but at the end of it, General LeMay said to Colonel Tibbets, he said, you got quite a young pilot there. So it was a feather in his cap. From there, they went to Wendover, Utah, or as Bob Hope used to call it, Leftover, because it was out in the middle of the salt flats. There was nothing around for years and miles. And my father came out of church on a Sunday morning, and he always said there were certain things in your life that you always remember the rest of your life. And he said that Sunday morning he walked out of church and the security officer pulled up. And he got into a Jeep, and he said he drove, like, seemed about 10 miles out in the middle of the desert. And he said, what are we doing? Why are we here? And the security officer said, have you ever heard of Einstein's theory of relativity? And my father said, I remember reading about it in the Saturday Evening Post, you know, in 1939, but, you know, I just remember it was about combustion and multiplying energy. And he said, yes, that's exactly what we're talking about. And he leaned over and he grabbed a handful of sand and he threw it up in the air. And he said, we're going to have one bomb, one plane, in one city. And he just threw and my father said, that's impossible. He said, there's no way you could do that. He said, right now in Tokyo, we're firebombing every night. And he said, you know, 500,000 people have been killed there. And he said, there's no way you could have one bomb, you know, one city, you know, one aircraft. And he said, well, that's what we're working on. And my father said, well, why am I here? He said, because you're going to train the pilots how to drop that bomb. So he just thought, you know.
That shows you the reputation he had as a flyer, and
right.
Sure.
So you know, I used to be an artillery officer in the Marine Corps, and, you know, it'd be easy for me. Someone would say, you know, after years of training, you know, someone would say, hey, you, this is me, I need firepower downrange. And I'd say, okay, you know, where are you, the FO? I knew where we were, and then where is the enemy? And I would just plot it out on the map. And what is the enemy? Is it troops in the open? Is it tanks? Whatever. And, you know, I had the weather, I knew that the deflection, you know, I had the ballistic table. I mean, I had everything, and 30 seconds later, I could put a round down range. So you can imagine, here's my dad being told, you're going to train somebody to drop a weapon that, first of all, you can't talk about it. And that's just what the security officer at that point told him about the Manhattan Project. And he said, don't ever use those words again. And then he told him about Operation Silver Plate, which was the name of the 509th, and he said, don't ever use those words again. And then he said, told him about Project Alberta, which was all the scientists that were working on the bomb. And he said, don't ever use those words about them. And he said, don't even use the word bomb. So it was so much secrecy around it, and he's thinking...
It was very secret. In fact, FDR's vice president had no knowledge of it at all. When Truman became president, that was the first he learned of it.
Right. There was so much secrecy around it, and so my father's thinking to himself, here am I going to train someone to use a weapon that's never been used, and I can't talk about it, and I can't talk about it with the co-pilot, you know, anybody else, and I can't call it a weapon, you know. So in any event, what they did was they made 10,000 concrete pumpkins, and they just started learning how to flying at 30,000 feet and dropping them and trying to get them to as close to a target. And of course, they were just taking all sorts of notes and elevation and deflection and all the ballistic tables, and they did this forever. And then in 1945, on July 16th, 1945, they did the Trinity test in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where they actually dropped an atomic bomb from staging, and it worked. And President Roosevelt had passed away. President Truman had been briefed on the weapon, and the static test worked. The scientists were all over the board. They said, okay, one said it will never work from an airplane. Another one said that anything within an 8-mile radius of the explosion will be blown out of the sky. And the third scientist said it's going to blow up the whole world. He said when it's dropped, he said it's just going to start an atomic reaction and discriminate the whole world.
That's a scary thought.
Right. And so now my father's 25, and in any event, so he, the president said we're going to go. So they all went to Tinian, and which it's talking going back to the young students. I understand their plight, but you have to study history. You have to understand not only about the bomb, but also about what was leading up to the bomb. About Pearl Harbor, where 3,000 Americans, children, mothers, fathers, boys, girls, servicemen and women, were killed by the Japanese on a Sunday morning, and they don't even know why. We weren't in a war. They don't even know why they died. And then, forget about the Pacific. I'm sorry, the Europe, all the casualties there. And then we were going to the Pacific, and being a Marine, obviously well versed in the history of Saipan, where 3,000 Marines were killed. Iwo Jima, 7,000 Marines killed. Guadalcanal, Tinian, Okinawa. That was, they estimated would be a 2-week battle. It took 82 days and 12,000 Americans. Not to mention that all the Japanese that were killed and all that were wounded. I mean, it was just, hundreds of thousands of people were getting killed.
Absolutely. And at the time, again, it's a good lesson for the youngsters to learn their history.
Right.
Japan was the aggressor. Japan had invaded Manchuria. They were invading China. They were just going island to island in the Pacific, taking things over.
Right.
So this wasn't, and the one thing about America, when you look back on any of our wars, it was never a land grab for America.
No,
World War
of course
II, we liberated Europe. What did Russia do? They came in and imposed communism in Eastern Europe. The U.S. didn't oppose anything except to help them rebuild and rebuild their lives. So your point is absolutely on. People have to learn history before you make. You can't apply today's standard to something 50 or 100 years ago.
Right. Don't be a Monday morning quarterback and say, well, 75 years ago, we shouldn't have do this. Learn what they were doing, the Bataan Death March. I'm just throwing out some buzzwords for these.
It's like Bob Curry Hardware. One of
Right.
his uncles died in the Bataan Death March. He was beheaded.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. They were vicious soldiers at that time. No question.
And you got to remember that the Japanese were ancient warriors. They were fierce in their fighting. And if it wasn't for the atomic bombs, Tojo and Hirohito would never have surrendered. They would have, it wouldn't have been an invasion. And they say up to a million, lives would have been lost. I've heard as low as 46,000 American lives would have been lost. But
Yeah, I'd heard 100,000 to 1 million American soldiers could have been lost.
Right.
Never mind the civilians in Japan.
Right.
How many millions more of them would have died and perished?
Right. So you got to take the whole war into when you understand it, to understand why we dropped the bombs. But getting back to the story, so my dad, he's 25 years old. They get to Tinian, and the president calls him up and he says, "Let's go." So President Truman. So Paul Tibbets flew his plane, the Enola Gay, which is named after his mom, and he said, "Put the bomb in my plane." My father, there were three planes three B-29s on East Mission. My father flew the right wing of the Enola Gay, and it was called the Instruments plane, where they had, they would drop like parachutes out to get the barometer readings and things, the weather readings and whatnot. And on the left wing of the Enola Gay was a gentleman named Fred Marquardt, and he had like the scientists and photographers and whatnot. So there was three planes on the mission. So they took off at August 6th, I think 2:45 in the morning. They all took off separately. They rendezvoused over Iwo Jima, and then they went in for the strike mission on Hiroshima. It was clear weather, clear sailing, and they everything worked. They went in, dropped the bomb. It worked. There was a flying maneuver they used to bank out of there because they thought it might. But in any event, they went back to Tinian and waited for higher ups to make a decision. We're actually waiting for Japan to surrender. And the next day, August 7th, Colonel Tibbets pulled my father in, and he said, Dad, I'm sorry, he said, Chuck, he said, if the Japanese don't surrender by tomorrow, we're going to drop another bomb, and I want you to command the mission. So my dad was actually the only one to actually fly on both missions. So any event, the Japanese did not surrender. So on August 9th, my father said, rather than have all the maintenance crew guys work through the night just to put the bomb in his plane, because he had all the instruments in his plane, he said, just put the bomb in Bach's car, Fred Bach, his buddy Fred Bach's plane, and he picked Fred to fly his plane with all the instruments. So that's why my dad flew Bach's car. They just switched planes. And the scientists and photographers were in another plane. But at 2:45 in the morning, they're doing all their pre-flight checks, and they had the first issue, and that was that one of the fuel pumps broke in Bach's car, and so they had 600 pounds of fuel they couldn't access. So my father went to Colonel Tibbets, and he said, "What do you think, boss?" And he said, "It's your call. You're the commander." So my father said, "Well, we can make it because I flew on the Hiroshima mission, and we had plenty of fuel when we returned." So he said, "We're going to go." So they took off. There was a typhoon. Anybody that's been in the Pacific, is familiar with typhoons. Over Iwo Jima that day, so they went to another island called Yokoshima. And they said, "We're going to rendezvous over there." Oh, it was funny. My father said to Tibbets when he told him, "You're going to go," and he said, "What are the tactics?" And he said, "The same tactics." And of course, my father's thinking, okay, 3 B-29s coming into a city, Japanese might suspect something. And he said, "Same tactics?" And he said, "Same tactics." So, aye, sir. So anyway, they got to the rendezvous point, and the third plane, my father and Fred Bach showed right up together. The third plane never showed up. So they said, what's going on with him? So they're already, have fuel they can't access. So they circled for 15 minutes, and they said, we better wait another 5 minutes or whatever. And so I think they waited around 30 minutes burning fuel. And the other guy never showed up. He turned out in the pre-flight brief, he thought they said 39,000, so he's 9,000 feet above them. So my father just looks at Bach, goes radio silence, and he says, "We're going." So the original target was Kokura. So they're going to Kokura, and at that point, the other pilot breaks radio silence and calls back to Tinney, and he said, "Did Sweeney abort?" And of course, that got gobbled in transmission as Sweeney aborted. So all the higher echelon thinks, okay, well, he must have trouble with his fuel pump, so he's coming back to Tinian. So my father's on his way to Kokora. And of course, he didn't want to break radio silence, so he just looked at Bach and said, we're going. And so, here he is, 25 years old with a nuclear weapon, and no one knows where he is. Wow. And because the other pilot called back, they pulled all the air and sea rescue in. They just said, you're done for the day. So he starts heading to Kokora. I know. So he starts heading to Kokora, and there was a city near Kokora called Yawata, and 244 B-29s had bombed it the night before because there was heavy armament plants there, and so the smoke from Yawata was blowing over Kokora. Their orders were to drop the bomb visually. So they passed over Kokora, and my father's bombardier, Kermit Bean, who was very experienced in bombing missions because he had come from Europe, said, I can't see the target. So my father said, well, against better judgment, I'm going to make another pass. So at this point, the Japanese Zeros, figure out what they were up to. So they send the Zeros up to start shooting at them. So my father said, they got to go to 31,000 feet, which they do. So they go to 31,000 feet. Because
the Zeros can't climb that.
Right, the Zeros can't get that high, and the bullets can, but so there's what they call it flak. Flak was going off, but they go to 31,000 feet, and still no target, no visibility. So my father says, against his better judgment, he's like, I'm burning fuel here I don't have. He said, I'm going to go to 32,000 feet. And so they went to 32,000 feet, and they still had no visibility of the city. So I think there's a term in Japan called Kokora luck. So my father looked at Bach, and he just said, we're going to secondary target, which was Nagasaki. So Nagasaki, they get over Nagasaki, and they had 80% cumulus cloud that day, and they only had enough fuel for one run. And so they get over Nagasaki, and Kermit Bean is on the site, and all of a sudden at the last minute, my father just said, I got it. And my father said, you own it. And they dropped the bomb. And again, it worked. They banked out of there. But my father said it was, as being the only man in history that had witnessed both explosions, he said it was just sort of surreal. He said you saw every color in the rainbow, every color ever imagined. And then there were concentric heats of circle of heats that just coming up and banging the aircraft. And but he knew enough to get out of there. There was a certain flying maneuver they used to get out of there. And of course, he looks at the fuel gauge, and he has enough for 300 miles. Well, the nearest island was Okinawa, which was 350 miles away. So he had, there was a thing called step flying that my father had figured out in the B-29. Sort of like if you're in your car and you're low on fuel and you put it in neutral to go down a hill. And so he just sort of did step flying and shut everything down. And Fred Bach stayed right with him. And when they were really low on fuel, when they could see Okinawa, and it was the busiest airfield in the Pacific. The 8th Air Force was based out of there. And so he's calling on the radio, Mayday, 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 Mayday. So they're flying to Okinawa. They can't raise the tower at Yonton Airfield, which is now Kadena. And my father says, shoot every flare you have out the window, which they do. He said it looked like the 4th of July. He had lost 3 engines, so they cleared the airfield, and he came in and just had lost all power and skated off the end of the runway, and of course all the fire trucks and And, the EMTs came running out to the aircraft, and my father got out, and he just said, don't anybody talk to anybody about anything. He said, the senior guy in charge, he said, I need to secure radio. So he called back to Tinian, and he said, mission accomplished. Details to follow. At that point, General Doolittle was the commander of the 8th Air Force, and he had summoned my father up, to his office. And my father said he walked in, and he said, I just stood there for about 5 minutes at attention, and Doolittle just looking at him, and Doolittle said, I just heard from Tinian, and they said, good job. He said, thank you, sir. He said, you're dismissed. And he said later in life, he was thinking about that, making him sit there, and he said, I wonder if General Doolittle was thinking who had the first raid on Japan, if my mission was the last raid on Japan, if he saw that irony of the two of us in the same room together.
Right, yeah.
So, in any event, they went back, they fixed the plane, and they refueled, and they went back and debriefed all the higher echelon, and Japanese surrendered 6 days later.
Yeah, I want to refer to the book for a minute,
Sure.
Joe, and there's a lot of stuff in the book, obviously.
The book is called War's End.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah,
War's End.
if anybody's interested in reading it.
And I know we talked about a little bit about your father writing the book because of revisionist history out there.
Right.
And it's important to know the facts, right? And,
Of course.
And obviously your father was an incredible guy, an incredible flyer for sure.
Yes, yeah.
Just going through that. And so they're back, and they're looking for Sunday services. Of course, you alluded to earlier, he was out of a Catholic mass, so he's looking for a priest. So he finds his priest, and he poses the question to the priest, is it a sin to wage war, Father? And, the priest was listening. He says, I'm a cleric, I'm in uniform, I'm in war as well. He says, but you're not a combatant, Father. You simply tend to the spiritual needs. He says, that is true. He said, but he basically alludes to one of the famous saints, St. Thomas Aquinas. And he said this. He says, someone far more saintly than I or you, Thomas Aquinas, struggle with the same question. Thomas believed that under certain circumstances, war is justified. First, he said the cause must be just. Secondly, the intention must be to advance the common good, to secure peace and punish evil. And finally, a just war must be declared by the lawful sovereign in defense of the common good. The absence of any one of these elements would make the act of war a sin. Now, some of the discussions we had about the whole piece of history, the Japanese were the aggressors, as were the Germans in World War II. We were attacked at Pearl Harbor. We went to Europe to help save mankind. I mean, when you think about the craziness of the Axis powers at that time, and this is where I urge our young people to do a little history. So here's a guy that goes to North Quincy High from Montclair, Quincy, Mass., and plays a major key role in bringing the war to an end. I mean, it's absolutely incredible.
Right. And you have to remember, as I said earlier, that the Japanese were fierce warriors. Not the Japanese people, but their leaders and their military. My father loved the Japanese people. But if you imagine, like my son is a pilot, but can you imagine if my son got accepted to the Naval Academy and then went to flight school, and he's 21 years old, and my wife and I are so proud, and all of a sudden his first mission is, okay, we're going to load up your plane with bombs, and we need you to fly into that U.S. aircraft carrier and give your life. And this was divine to them. This was
The kamikaze.
a kamikaze.
Yeah.
Divine wind. This was their mentality.
Which was brand new to warfare. I mean,
Yes, of course.
Our folks and people in the Navy, those vessels, that was a complete shock
Right.
to
How
them.
many thousands of U.S. servicemen died because of kamikazes? And, you know, in Okinawa, how many thousand, because they used to kamikaze the airfields at Yonton and Kadena, so we couldn't take off out of there. But can you imagine, this was the mentality of the Japanese warrior, to, you know, give your life, you know, so,
I recently watched The Pacific, which was Tom Hanks, Steven Spielberg's series, and it really showed the war in the Pacific, and then the need for the islands was to build airfields so
Of
those
course.
B-29s could make their
Exactly.
way to Japan,
Exactly, yeah.
in a goal to end the war. But there was,
Right.
I remember hearing when I was a kid, there was a guy named Vinnie Smith who was a ward counselor, who was a Marine, and the stories of Guadalcanal. They had to go out and push the bodies out of the way because they're getting in the way of the machine gunners.
Right,
And
right.
I saw a scene like that in the Pacific, and it made sense to me. I said, wow, these were kids, 18, 19, 20, 21
course,
years old,
yeah.
putting it on the line for freedom, for real.
Right.
world.
Yeah, they were the greatest generation. There's no question about it. And don't forget about, you know, all the people in Europe that fought. And as Colin Powell once said, the only thing the United States ever asked for is enough land to bury our dead.
That's right. Yeah.
You know, that's
Yeah.
all we've ever asked for, you know.
We are a unique nation, and since its inception,
Right.
it's remarkable how we've come together and it took a long time before we became a nation. We were a union,
Right.
but to become a nation, and
Yeah.
it's absolutely incredible what the veterans have done to save this. So I want to thank you for your service. I mean,
Oh, thank you.
You came out as a colonel.
I did,
You
yeah.
served
I
your
did.
nation.
I did, yeah.
And I'm sure your dad was quite proud.
Yeah.
And I know in this little discussion we're having this discussion with some others, it's about the dedication of the General's Bridge and General's Park that's going to
Yeah.
be happening this year.
Oh.
And we're really singling out 7 more of the modern era,
Yeah.
and your dad is one of them, so we certainly look
So
forward
it's the
to
city of presidents and generals.
City of Presidents, City of Patriots, City of Generals,
That's right.
absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's a great city, and it's just great history, great history.
I'd love to read from the book, The War's End, your father's quote on the back of the book. Maybe we can finish with that. I certainly do not offer this book as a celebration of the use of nuclear weapons. It is my fervent hope that there will never be another atomic mission. In 1945, we dropped bombs that were primitive in comparison to nuclear weapons today. As the man who commanded the last atomic mission, I pray that I retain that singular distinction. He goes on to say, I am memorializing my story because I have learned that we who have lived the events of history have an obligation to preserve and report upon the facts. The soul of a nation, its essence, is its history.
Yes,
Well, General Sweeney was a big part of our history
yeah,
and a big part of bringing World War II to an end. So we're
yeah.
glad to celebrate and honor him. And Colonel Joe Sweeney, we thank you for participating today.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.